I'm going to riff on an inspiration begun with a Jordan Peterson comment, which is that when you have been mistreated, when you have been violated in some way, when you feel resentment, one of two things needs to happen. Either you need to set boundaries and renegotiate the relationship if you're being stepped on and mistreated, or you need to grow up. So when there's resentment, when there's self-pity, when there's a feeling that I've been wronged, it requires a response for it not to deteriorate into resentment and envy, and then seeking to destroy that which one is envious of. Either we need to set a new boundary, redress and rebalance the relationship, or we need to grow up. And so much of trauma, so much of abuse is in this nexus. Now, for a child who's sexually abused, it's incredibly cruel to demand of that child what is demanded of them when there is no adult present. Because when there's no adult present, the demand on that child is you grow up so that we, the grown-ups, can be children. You grow up and learn to defend yourself against a giant so that the rest of the world around you can behave like juveniles. And it's an incredibly big injustice to ask of a 6-year-old that they do something that no grown-up in the vicinity is able and willing to do. Because for a 6-year-old to be molested without support and to be abandoned in trauma is for every single grown-up in that vicinity, in the vicinity of the 6-year-old, to be so psychologically illiterate, so incompetent, so sociopathic, that every single one involved either does not recognize a sexual predator when they see one, a pedophile. They don't recognize what they're looking at, which requires an incredible amount of ignorance on all sides. Of course, the 6-year-old recognizes the pedophile. It's hard not to. But no one else will do that in their vicinity. So either no one recognizes the pedophile, or no one is mature enough to protect a 6-year-old from that pedophile. Now, either way, the entire cult, the entire culture is behaving like a child. Meaning for sexual predation of this nature to be so intergenerational for so many thousands of years, and to maintain the level of willful ignorance that is necessary for every single person in the vicinity not to recognize what is going on right before their eyes, is a level of willful blindness, of incompetence, of sociopathic cruelty that places the burden on growing up on that 6-year-old. So either they don't notice or they don't care. Either way, we're dealing with children. We're dealing with sociopathic children who would rather let another child deal with the issue than take on responsibility and authority to protect that child. So the demand then is for the 6-year-old to grow up and do what no one else is willing to. And that's too much. That's too much. And so the 6-year-old protests. The 6-year-old self-mutilates. The 6-year-old becomes passive-aggressive. The 6-year-old starts and tries to undermine the system that abandons it to horror, terror, and shame in loneliness, without a single adult amongst all the grown-ups present. So this is the attack, the blame, the hostility, the undermining, the covertness, the self-attack. That is an effort for a psychologically illiterate 6-year-old in a psychologically illiterate culture to address the grievance, the imbalance. So that's one thing that can happen. Either the 6-year-old could grow up, but they cannot biologically. Now, when you're dealing with a 40-year-old, biologically you have the potential. A 6-year-old cannot grow up. They don't have the brain. Now, a traumatized, regressed, repressed, shamed 40-year-old, it's questionable. Has their brain developed despite the trauma, etc., that occurred for them at 6-year-old? Has their brain developed to a level where their brain can respond to the situation? Now, in a situation where they have the brain capacity and the physical capacity and the legal capacity and the financial capacity to respond, to address the issue, then comes in more of this question. Do I challenge my environment to be more intelligent, to be more conscientious, to attune more to best practices, to stop being so bloody unfair? Or do I grow up? Do I accept the power, the authorship, to respond to the situation around me? And that's a negotiation. Can I get my government to be more ethical? Can I get my parents to be more responsible? Can I get my spouse to be less abusive? Can I get my boss to be less promiscuous? Can I do that, first of all? And that's usually an easy first step, because if there's an injustice and an illegality, a wrong that's going on out there, and the person doing the wrong is mature enough that bringing the wrong to their attention is enough to curb the behavior, then, enough said. You complain, why didn't you do this, you did this, that's illegal, this is this, you complain, and they respond. They address the wrong. And you don't need to grow up necessarily to do that, although you might, because as a 6-year-old, if you learned that you would die because your abuser threatened to kill you, and part of you still feels 6 years old and you never told about the abuse because you feared you would die. You feared you would die socially. You feared you would die economically. You feared you would die physically. Everyone would tease you. Everyone would not do business with you. You would be beaten up. You would be killed by the abuser. So there is a facing of death that needs to go on in order to speak about the abuse. And so there is a growing up from that regressed small part to the one willing to confront and deal with the abuse. But if you've got that already, meaning if you have surmounted and transcended the part of you that believes you will die based on past events in one form or another, if you confront the abuse. Confronting the abuse then is not a very big deal. This is wrong, please address this, and it gets addressed, and you don't have to grow up. But if you bring this to an abuser, a government, an employer, police official, an attorney who doesn't know how to respond, who cannot, it doesn't matter whether you put a gun to their head, they do not know what to do. Meaning, in a childlike culture that raises a large degree of grown children and adolescents, there's a lot of people who do not know what to do in many of the common circumstances that the culture will throw at them. So if you are one of them, or your abuser is one of them, and you do not know what to do, the abuser is just doing what was done to them by another unconscious abuser. And they never learned to stand up to the abuse either. And if they tried, their abuser refused to own and deal with the abuse. And so, there's no model, there's no map to say, here's what a pedophile does when confronted with damaging children in the neighborhood. They move. They don't heal or deal with the abuse. They run away. They deny. That's all we've got. What does it look like? What would someone who has been pedophilically abused, sexually abused as a child, and who is now sexually abusing children, what does it look like in a psychologically illiterate, relationally illiterate, traumatically illiterate culture? What does it look like for a pedophile to healthily respond to that and make amends that make a positive difference in the children they've hurt? What does that look like? See, we have no idea, because we are psychologically illiterate in a psychologically illiterate cult that is willfully ignorant in these critical areas. So what does it look like to confront the abuser? And what do you do when your abuser doesn't know what the fuck they're doing? They couldn't repair it if they tried. They've never seen any of their abusers repair the damage. They're terrified of going to jail. They don't know why they're behaving the way they do in an intergenerational abuse cycle. And nor does anyone else in a psychologically illiterate cult. So what do you do when your abuser doesn't know what the fuck they're doing, cannot repair the damage? Now, again, I was sexually abused by a therapist, and the problem with that is much like the child, the 6-year-old, in relationship to a parent who's abusing them. When you're going to therapy to get help with something, by definition, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know necessarily. And you don't know how to know what you don't know that you don't know. Because you don't know that you don't know it. You're in a learning environment. And the trust is in the masculine figure, of the authority figure, of the therapist. But obviously, a therapist that sexually abuses a client, that spiritually abuses a client, doesn't know what they're doing. And do they know enough to acknowledge that? And how do you respond when you bring the evidence? This is abuse. Here, this is the abuse. And there's silence. Or that wasn't so bad, or could we move on now? When they don't know how to respond and heal the abuse. You see, in this situation, the child has no choice but to punish, to rebel, to attack, to undermine, to protest, to have a tantrum, to wait. Is there any adult? Because a child is frozen in time until one of the many grown-ups around them learns to be an adult, learns to respond to a helpless child in a regressed, traumatized state. Heal the trauma that they cannot deal with alone, that should never have been given to them in the first place. A child has to wait. Now, the question is, do you need to set a new boundary? You see, and this is the trouble with therapy in a traumatic setting, is because it's a dependent relationship. A child is dependent on the parent. If you know or you believe you need help, and you know or you believe that your therapist at least claims that they can help you, then it creates, the more pain there is, the more dependency there is in that relationship, because we don't know what we don't know. And if we do know what we don't know, we don't necessarily know how to know what we know we don't know. And we don't have the confidence and the experience that comes from sustained response. And so, we can cling, we can, please, therapist, be a therapist, grow up, be an adult, lead the way. I don't see clearly here. And so there can be that movement. But the other option is, of course, to grow up ourselves. And, this takes time, it takes effort. And it's terrifying in many ways when the grown-ups that you trust or the authority figures you trust, whether it's parents or therapists or government, turn out to be the enemies of the process, turn out to have hidden agendas that transcend your well-being. When a parent would rather transfer their shame unconsciously to the child and deny all responsibility more than they care about loving their child. When a therapist has agendas to transfer onto their patient that they care about more than the safety and the well-being of their patient. When the government has agendas, laws, regulations that they care about more than the well-being of their people, then you are alone in a psychologically illiterate culture. And the question is, what do you do? How do you respond? Because you need data. You need data. And so the process, if you cannot find an authority figure who can walk you through the quagmire of the unknown, of the massive events going on, then you have to grow up eventually, or die traumatized, regressed, and never having lived. And how much to pursue as a grown-up oneself, growing up, or justice, or redress, or challenging the system to improve and refine some of its many inequities. And that's really what I want to explore. And the other thing that I want to explore, bring in here, is the issue of scale. A 6-year-old needs a guidance figure, needs a parental figure to mediate the energy of the world, because the world is too unregulated and too big. It's overloading, overwhelming the system of the 6-year-old. So the child must form a partnership with an authority figure, a projected or actual parent. And the actual parent and projected parent must mediate the relationship between the child and the world that is too big, too unattuned, too violent, too fast for that 6-year-old. And so you have the triad of the child, the adult, or at least the grown-up, and the world. Now, as soon as you move the adult that's protecting that child into an unknown environment, into a big unknown in a relationship with a large unknown object, they are again overwhelmed. They again need an ally. They need an adult. And that adult needs to buffer and mediate the energy with a much larger world. And so really it's an issue of scale. We can deal with things that are 5 times bigger or smaller, faster or slower, more complex or more simple. We can deal with energies that are 5 times bigger, 5 times smaller, for the most part, and not go into trauma, the disruption of our pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in a helpless state. We can do that. Up to, 1 to 3 scale is pretty comfortable. But once we start relating to things that are 10 times stronger than us, or 10 times weaker than us, 10 times bigger than us, or 10 times smaller than us, in these areas that are bigger, in the areas that are smaller, we can become traumatic. We can become the violator. In the areas that are bigger than us, 10 times bigger, 10 times wealthier, etc. In a sociopathic relationship where there is not understanding and attunement, those relationships, those exchanges are going to be exchanges of violation, where the big violates the small, or it's just random whether they do or not. It's doing its own thing, you're small, you're connecting, and you need an intermediate, you need a mediator. But that mediator needs a mediator as well, with something that's 10 times more complex, or 10 times bigger, or 10 times stronger, or 10 times more unknown than they are. And so there's this dynamic where the child that needs an adult to mediate with a world that's 10 times bigger than them, that adult becomes a child in relationship to an environment that's 10 times bigger than them. In other words, just because you mature, just because you grow up and develop confidence in a given status quo, does not mean that as you move into the unknown, just because you've set up shop in Maine and are running a business successfully and are profitable in Maine, where they speak English with American law, and this does not mean that if you are plunked illegally in a Chinese city where no one speaks English, where things are happening all over the place and it's overwhelming, it's 10 times more unknown, and it's fast and it's big and you're threatened on all sides, you then become as a child in that bigger environment. In other words, the psychological state of adulthood is largely dependent on the scale of the challenge one is confronting. How unknown it is, how sociopathic it is, how traumatized you are psychologically and physiologically. If you are traumatized psychologically and physiologically, as most of us are, in a way that has not been adequately addressed, which for most of us has not occurred, being in a big, complex, new environment will be experienced through the eyes of a child, through the eyes of fear, through the eyes of overwhelm. And it will only be as we develop confidence, if we succeed, if we don't die, and develop confidence in our rapport and an ability to navigate that landscape, we will then mature in the new landscape. We will become an adult. That's why many people are silent in a brand new group that's completely different. They watch and they learn to adjust and figure out what is acceptable and what isn't, what gets punished and what gets rewarded. Then slowly they'll enter the group and move from being very reserved, shy, childlike identities into being more comfortable, more themselves, more mature, less hesitant. So in any given situation where we have been violated, where we have been traumatized, where we are in the unknown, how much do we ask our abusers, our government, our parents, the people around us to grow up so that they can be an adult for us in this terrifying, traumatized, unknown terrain? And how much do we grow up ourselves? And I think the answer is we grow up as much as we can, as fast as we can, as effectively as we can, without that having been modeled for us by competent adults. Because if we were surrounded by competent adults, we would not have to grow up in order to recover from traumatic abuse. Because adults don't behave that way. Grown-ups do. Psychologically illiterate children do in grown-up bodies. But adults don't violate in that way. And so how do you grow up when you're surrounded by children and you're carrying a shitload of energy, the ignorance, the fear, the rage, the self-hatred, the shame of an entire cult that's coming down on the scapegoat, that's coming down on the recipient? How do you grow up when it takes love to grow? And there's no love in that hostility of abandonment and betrayal. And how do you learn to self-love when you are given the fear and hatred of others to carry? This is the challenge. Your abuser, your government can grow up a little bit, sometimes 1%, sometimes 2%, but that's not enough to get out of an overwhelming crisis that's 6,000% bigger than you are. So it takes bite-sized pieces. It takes discipline, studying the language of trauma, reading the literature of abuse, learning what's going on here, learning to put language to sensation, learning to communicate, learning to extricate oneself from the old tattered identity, learning to form a new identity, a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that's more intelligent than the old pattern. Forgiveness does not happen until a successful new identity is formed. One cannot forgive out of terror. One cannot forgive out of trauma. One cannot forgive out of hate. Hate, trauma, terror, uncertainty, fixation, addiction are symptomatic of overwhelming trauma that's not being dealt with, that's not being loved by a competent outside source. And so in order to respond to that, to develop self-love, means to heal the illusion of ignorance, to restore literacy to our psychological blindness, to our traumatic blindness, to learn the mathematics, the probability fields around which we're dealing with, to honor the steps towards growth. When a new identity is successfully formed, it's called post-traumatic growth. Hanging on to the old, be it the abuser, be it the identity of the abused becomes less relevant. We have something new, a new shape, a new identity to grow into. So, back to Jordan Peterson. When you feel self-pity, when you feel terrified, when you feel hate, when you feel resentment, when you feel envy, and want to destroy that which one envies, does one reach out and shake, demand? You can ask many parents for 40 years to grow up and learn to be competent parents, and they never will. But how long does one shake that dead horse? And how soon is one capable of growing up enough so that one can discard it? This is the question. And we shake, we protest, we hate, we seek revenge, we lament, we complain, we manipulate, and we control as much as we can to soften the burden of trauma and hate given to us by the cult. And we study, we learn, we grow, we read, we practice, we explore, we experiment as much as we can to form a new identity that is capable of transcending the old pattern of abuse. And when we do, forgiveness is natural. Empathy is natural. Pity is natural. Because it's no fun to be an abuser, and it's no fun to be abused. It's terrifying to be an abuser, and it's terrifying to be abused. They are one and the same in a certain way. And while the abuser may convince themselves in an abuse identity that this is who they want to be, no healthy person enjoys abusing another person, and no sickness came out purely of the self. All contagious diseases were originally caught in the environment by other people who had the flu, by other people who had trauma, by other chauvinistic morons who contracted the disease of chauvinistic moronic behavior by other chauvinistic morons and then gave it to you. For you to be a chauvinistic moron, you have to have caught both stupidity and chauvinism from other people, number one. Your environment had to be conducive to you catching that disease, number two. And your culture and your environment has to be conducive to sustaining that disease in yourself. Because if your culture or your ecology healed those diseases in you, you would not have them. And it is no fun to be sick. It is no fun to be sick with chauvinism. It is no fun to be sick with racism. It is no fun to be sick with bitterness and hate. It's no fun to be sick with sadistic rage and envy. These diseases are transmitted from one infected party in an environment conducive to infection to another person susceptible to infection, or they die out. And it takes a sustained amount of willful cultural ignorance, colluded with by a large majority of at least 70%, in order for these things to be as intergenerational as they are.